All right, all right. So AP Hub's History Online, jumping away from World War II and into one of the most important and one of the most devastating events in world history, the Cold War. Starting with the name, the Cold War, I want to make sure you guys understand that it wasn't a war that was fought in the winter. As a matter of fact, the Cold War wasn't really a war at all. It was more of a conflict that involved ideologies, capitalism versus communism, or democracies versus communism. In reality, the Cold War was nothing more than a period of hostility and anger between two nations, the US and the Soviet Union. But one of the things that strikes me as odd as the fact that they call it a Cold War when these two men, and when I say men, I mean Uncle Sam versus the Russian bear, well, I guess an animal too, they never actually fought each other. And that is one of the more astonishing elements of war because when you look at World War II, you have the Allied powers versus the Axis powers. In World War I, you have the Allied powers versus the Central powers. But the Cold War was different. It really was similar in all ways to a war because it was two sides, the world divided. Communism and its allies versus the democracies and their allies. And that's really what the Cold War is about. But one of the things we bring up is the fact that the Cold War itself, its roots lie in the end of World War II. When World War II ended, just like all wars, there has to be a treaty signed to formally surrender. Now we know that Germany surrendered 1 week after Hitler killed himself, and we also know that Japan surrendered in August 1945 after 2 atomic bombs. But one of the things that we look at when we look at the war as a whole, we look at the total cost of the war, an estimated $1 trillion. On the map here, on the picture here, excuse me, the chart, it only has 6 nations. But please do not be fooled. Other nations spent billions of dollars getting ready for this war. But we also talk about the death of more than 65 million people. Russia alone sustained more than 22 million. Germany around 7 million. I mean, it's a massive death toll. So World War II is definitely the most destructive war in world history. But when this war ended, this was going to be different. The United States was not going to sit around on the sideline. As a matter of fact, they were not allowed to sit on the sideline. Woodrow Wilson sat on the sideline before World War I until they were forced into the war. Unfortunately, joining the war tends to hurt someone's leadership, and especially when the fact that he really didn't do anything to stop future wars. This is kind of why the United States couldn't sit this one out. FDR was ready to work out these peace agreements, but he died prior to the atomic bombs. That left it to Harry Truman. So we have 3 nations, the US, the British, and the Soviets. So this was the original Big Three. This was a meeting from early in 1945, right after Germany was surrendered. And this is a peace meeting where not only does Germany surrender to the Allied forces, but from this moment on, Germany would be divided into 4 pieces. France gets a piece, the Soviet Union gets a piece, the British get a piece, and the United States get a piece. They do this so Germany could never rise again. Now, if you notice the second picture here, a couple of things are different. Churchill is not in the picture, nor is FDR. Of course, the one mainstay is our Russian friend, Joseph Stalin, the man of steel. And he was at both of these meetings to make sure that not only does Germany formally surrender, but he really did it as a way to solidify his control over Eastern Europe. And we'll get to that in a little while. So these 2 conferences, the Yalta, Germany finally surrendered, and the Potsdam Conference is where Japan finally surrendered, and they also instituted the policies to punish people for the crimes in Nuremberg, the Nazi death trials. So what ends up happening, of course, is these peace negotiations, they don't make the same mistake that they did in World War I. Meaning Germany is divided and they are okay with it, but they're not going to impose massive restrictions on Germany. They really had to avoid a second repeat, or in this case, what would have been World War III. When the Cold War begins, it wasn't like a traditional war. We have two major superpowers. That's a new term they coined during the beginning of the Cold War, superpowers, because after World War II, only two real nations had that claim to that name, superpower, the United States and the Soviet Union. So this is literally how the world is divided. So just like this is divided evenly here, you have our Uncle Sam focusing on his money, and you have Russian Bear focusing on communism right here. Everyone sees. Now, for political cartoons, the Russians will always be a bear, and it's very easy to draw Uncle Sam as the traditional US cartoon. So you could see that they're both about to slap each other. The reason why I love this picture is because this picture, frozen in time, is exactly what the Cold War was. The US, I'm going to hit you, Russia, and they never did. And the Russians, I'm going to hit you, America, and they never did. So just imagine the United States and the USSR standing like that, about to hit each other, but they stand that way for 46 years. 46 years. The US and the USSR will be close to war, but they never actually fight. So when you see a question on what the Cold War is, the Cold War is simply a conflict over ideologies. Capitalism versus communism, democracies versus communism. But one of the scary things is that this war lasted for that long without the US and the USSR ever fighting each other. Now, one of the things that came up at the conferences following World War II was how to rebuild Europe. They couldn't allow what happened in World War I to happen again. If you remember, Italy was so desperate that they turned to Mussolini. Germany was so desperate, they turned to Hitler. It's not uncommon that when people are desperate, they turn to what they think is the right move or the right leader, but it always tends to blow up in their face. The Marshall Plan was our attempt to help Europe rebuild with a twist. The twist, of course, is we were literally buying allies. Anyone who wanted money from the good old United States of America could have it. They could have it all. Millions and millions and millions of dollars free. The only thing you had to do in return was be an allied democracy. So if you look on this chart here, the stacks of money are how much we gave. So we gave Portugal a little bit, Iceland a little bit, even Turkey got a little bit, Yugoslavia. But then you look at our buddies. Oh my God, look at France and England. Holy moly. We gave them billions. So all of these countries that we gave money to now were allied with us. So I'm going to draw an imaginary line here. Any country this way. So we're talking about Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. We are not allowed to give them money. The Russians won't allow us. So we got all the allies we could on Western Europe. Unfortunately, Eastern Europe was going to be picked apart. So we promised aid. Money was part of it. We also promised military aid, political support, whatever they needed. General George Marshall became the Secretary of the State who basically made this possible. He said it was a smart move, and this was a way not only to build allies, but to make sure that these countries did not turn to communism. So one of the other things you're going to see is that they also had to swear off communism, which was easy because we gave them billions and billions and billions of dollars. In the end, $13.3 billion was spread out over 4 years to any nation that needed it. We became the very thing that we wanted to avoid after World War I. We became the beacon of hope, the beacon of democracy, the leader of the free world. Russia, of course, did not like that one bit. Now, this is a wonderful, wonderful political cartoon. You got basketball. Here's the Marshall Plan. European recovery. He's got to get it in the hoop. We shoot. Do we score? That's the question. But yet his comrade stolen. Can he block it? Can he stop our aid? The answer is niet. No, he can't. Unfortunately, if he intervened, understand that he's staying at this level. If he intervened, it may have instigated World War III. So Stalin, even though he wanted to stop it, could do nothing at the time. He had to allow the United States to save Western Europe. Now, what ends up getting, I guess, I'm not going to say built per se, but ideologically built, theoretically built, is an imaginary wall between two worlds. Stalin will develop massive control in Eastern Europe. The United States will have massive influence in Western Europe. So what ends up happening is this red line here. It's an imaginary wall, it's not a real wall, but they called it the Iron Curtain. On this side we have communism, and on this side we have democracy. We now have two worlds. They call them blocks, B-L-O-C, a block. The Democratic Western Bloc, the Communist Eastern Bloc. As a matter of fact, the only communist nation in the world, Yugoslavia, that was not allied with the Soviet Union, swore to stay out of any conflicts, which is why we gave them money. We didn't mind that they were communist. Actually, we did. I'm not going to lie. We did not like it one bit that they were communist. But they did not interfere with our dealings in Western Europe, which is kind of why we left them alone. That and the fact that they didn't really get along with the USSR is another reason why. But for the most part, the Iron Curtain is going to split Europe into two major sections. This is a better map of the Iron Curtain. Now, this map is actually from later in the 1960s and 70s, because you're going to see that Spain will eventually join the fight against communism much later than some of the other nations. Switzerland never really gets involved. I don't know why they colored it blue. I think they just did it to clearly show the communist world versus the Western democratic world. But the truth is, Switzerland kind of never got involved, and that's irrelevant anyway. But now we have two sides, communism versus democracy. No admittance by the order of Joe, Uncle Joe, our friend. All right, our friend, Uncle Joe. And when you look at this imaginary wall, it's the tale of two worlds. A thriving, Western, democratic, capitalist superpower versus communist worlds that struggled economically. It is really going to be an interesting 46 years, that's for sure. Now, after FDR dies, I told you Harry Truman became the president of the United States. And Truman was the man who dropped the 2 atomic bombs on Japan. So we know that he is not going to back down from any threat. And one of the things that he's most known for became known as the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine stated that communism was an evil force trying to poison the world. Basically, we couldn't allow it. As democratic freedom fighters or supporters of independence, we couldn't allow communism to infect any other areas. So we instituted a policy called the Truman Doctrine. This was going to offer money and aid to anyone who needed it to stop communist growth. Now, what is interesting to see is that our plan also involved this thing called containment. So the belief was to keep communism here. All right, we didn't want communism coming this way. We succeeded there. The problem is communism is going to sneak out the back door, and it's going to infiltrate places like China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, North Korea. So even though our plan was to contain communism, we eventually do fail. We really can't tell the world what to believe. We can't tell a nation of people that their ideology is wrong just because we don't agree with it. One of the big problems of the Cold War is that it really seems like two countries of the world are trying to force their ideas and their beliefs down the throats of the rest of it. The truth is, democratic world was very, very attractive. It offered peace to its people and freedom and independence and economic growth and all the goodness. But communism had some merits too, and that's one of the things that we failed to see. Here's why. Joseph Stalin really wasn't the greatest example of what a communist nation can be. And neither is North Korea. China, however, offers a better example of what communist world could be like. Because they are in fact still today communist, they can prove that communism itself can exist in a democratic world. This is it for day one of the Cold War. We have 5 total days of the Cold War. It is one of the biggest events in world history. I hope this clarified the beginnings or the origins of the Cold War. I will catch you guys on the next lesson. Have a great one.